Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time for the year-end list. Well, we finally made it to the end of 2024. I mean, at least if we're purely talking about my personal life instead of the state of the world at large, it was technically better than last year. I am currently in a better place mental health-wise than I was at the end of 2023. Things are starting to look up a little bit for me personally. And as for the kind of year electronic music had, it was alright, I've seen better. I'm gonna be honest, 2024 was maybe a little bit of an off year for the genre. It reminded me a lot of what 2019 was like for this genre. The first half of this year was unbelievably slow, with almost nothing that really stuck with me. I felt like I only would have had 3 or 4 albums that could have been contenders at the mid-year, and let's just say the album that did hit the most for me at the mid-year gave me maybe a slightly worrying feeling. And while things picked up in the second half of the year with enough highlights to fill out a list that I was all happy and comfortable enough with, there was still a distinct lack of 8 out of 10 material over the course of 2024 in comparison to most years, let alone higher rates. My number one album this year, I don't know if it would have even made my top 5 last year. It would have definitely made my top 5 the year before that, but still. Now, the fact that I listened to a lot more new music alone ensures this wasn't a nearly as dry a year as 2019 was. I gave out an absolute crap ton of 7s this year, with very little in the 6 or lower category. But longer term keepers became somewhat rare, lots of stuff that was lots of fun in the moment, but I didn't really feel the urge to come back to. This was also a big year for artists I love and had high expectations for, merely delivering pretty good albums that didn't really stand up among their best work. Including albums that got more acclaim from everyone else. Looking at Fortet, Monolake, Justice, Underworld, Music, gonna be honest, also Ski Mask or Igloo Ghost, just to name a few. Again, none of those were bad albums, just not ones that stuck with me as much as I would have wanted. And paradoxically, this list actually isn't as overflowing with random Bandcamp finds as the last handful have been either. Not to worry, you'll still get plenty of under-the-radar picks on the list, but I don't know, I guess the underground wasn't really going above and beyond for me in comparison with other years, I guess. Still, that's obviously not to take away from all the quality we did get this year, both underground and mainstream. Maybe even a little more mainstream than usual this time. My top picks of the year feel very representative of this specific moment in time for what's popular in the genre, and like they could go down as notable highlight moments for these ongoing trends, even in a year where I was getting kind of burned out on said trends. This year is also notable for having the least distance in quality between the top and bottom of the list in quite a long time, since at least 2018. There's really not that pronounced a difference between how much I enjoyed my number 1 pick and my number 10 pick, which made it all the harder to pin this ranking down. There is not a single placement on the list proper which is that well cemented or couldn't easily switch around depending on my mood. It's clear that at the end of the day, we still got a lot of quality new electronic music this year. No year will ever be completely empty. And all 10 of the actual placements on the list proper are comfortably in 8 out of 10 territory, which isn't always guaranteed either, so yeah, let's finally get to discussing which ones meant the most to me over the past 12 months. Insert the usual disclaimers about being just my opinion and being a personalist, which is not set in stone here, especially the part about being not set in stone, which I kind of already went over. Feel free to post your own lists in the comments if you feel so inclined, or if you want to throw in other X that I might have missed earlier in the year. But yeah, let's not waste any more time and just get into it. This is the top 10 best albums of 2024. So before we get into the list, let's go through a bunch of honorable mentions. Honorable mention number 1, Square Pusher, Dastro Time. Alright, let's start with a name that people actually know, and in a year absolutely chock full of artists I love putting out albums that I didn't love, it was nice to get a comeback that left me feeling as satisfied as this one. I mean, there's nothing here you haven't heard him do before plenty of times, but I stand by this being his best work since Eufabulum, feeling like it's bringing together nearly every previous era of his career together all at once. Tracks that sound retro or modern, tracks focused on the brighter melodies or crazy percussion workouts, his typically phenomenal bass shredding all over the place, even some nice ambience and guitar pieces sprinkled around for extra flavor. It's a reminder of everything that made Square Pusher one of my all-time favorite artists, including the versatility, not just a shallow nostalgia trip like Biappa Hello sorta was. If he's going to enter into the legacy phase of his career at this point, I think so long as he keeps bringing material as strong and well-varied as this, then I'm not going to complain too much. Honorable mention number 2, Blue Shades, Meet the Leaf Mask. And here's easily the most under-the-radar pick I had in consideration for the list. This artist, who I was first introduced to through a pretty solid little electroacoustic IDM album in 2022, has gotten a bit more ambitious with his sound, moving into some very Beatles-inspired psychedelic indie pop with a lot of those electronic influences kind of continuing to swirl around it. And it's just stuck with me and kept me wanting to come back to it. All the tunes are really catchy, the vocal harmonies are really nice, the psychedelic instrumentals are all nicely well-textured and imaginative feeling. Mastering's a little on the quiet side, but it's still serviceable for what it's going for. I think as of the time I'm recording this, I'm still the only person who actually paid money for this album on Bandcamp, and I think there needs to be a lot more people hearing this since it's really good. Please give this guy more attention and support. Honorable mention number 3, Knit, Big Bang Puzzle. You know, if you talked to me at the mid-year, this would have been my number 2 favorite album of 2024. The mix of bright and colorful French touch and new disco with quirky 70s synth soundtrack and easy listening pastiches was such a joy to get when I first came across it, hitting a similar kind of note for me as artists like Bent, iCube, and Chateau Flight, and scratching such a specific musical itch for me that doesn't get scratched very often. It was awesome. By the end of this year, however, I feel like I'd be okay if I didn't have to hear this album again for a while. I'll freely admit the buzz I got from first discovering this one wore off with enough repeat listens and I got sick of it. It's now just a very good album that I like more for certain standout moments such as Insecure, Zoom, Puzzle Effect, Primero Amor, or Drawn to Me than I do for the whole unbroken package. Also, other commercial-leaning house records that came in near the end of the year I think ended up supplanting the experience with better sequencing and pacing. Doesn't really help that this album's worst moment is its intro track. But I think much of this change of heart was just a result of self-inflicted overexposure. It felt like there were so few great albums in the first half of this year that I came back to this one more than was probably healthy, and maybe kinda ruined it for myself. I mean, you can only have so much candy and sweets before you get a stomach ache. But still, for the amount of replay value I did get out of it over 2024, it was all but guaranteed to at least get a mention here. And I can still easily recommend it for those looking for that kind of candy-coated downtempo and disco, or who feel their taste for good French touch music hasn't been well served enough in years. Pretty dang overlooked, too. Still definitely worth checking out. Honorable mention number 4, Susie Analog, Ones. I'm not sure how much it's cheating to include a mixtape mostly consisting of material released 3 to 5 years ago, but I had never listened to any Susie Analog before finding this project through Bandcamp Daily this year, and it was definitely one of the random Bandcamp finds from this year that most consistently held up anytime I came back to it, and stuck in my mind the most. There are so many different flavors of classic retro underground club bangers on this thing, be it abstract footwork bangers, including a crossover with Jaylin, acid techno bangers flipping classic 90s R&B songs, hip-hop bangers, including a cut with rapper Blue, one absolutely inspired flip of a sample Jay Dilla used on Donuts turned into a crazy unhinged dance track, among other things. This was just such a fun and widely varied experience that went so consistently hard that I felt like I needed to mention it here. Honorable mention number 5, Luttrell, Life at Full Speed. This is probably the most last-minute addition to the list, but man, with the absolute deluge of house music we've gotten over the past several years, I was low-key starting to miss trance. Well, good trance, at least. So it was nice to get a deep house record like this out of Anjuna Deep, which did have some pretty heavy trance influences, and gave me a similar kind of refreshed feeling that the best commercial trance releases can, providing a decent variety of emotional grooves going from the more airy and pleasant side and delicate Robert Miles pastiches to catchy stuttered and sampled hooks to some really heavy and propulsive bangers as well, all trying to evoke the feelings Luttrell was going through as he became a father for the first time and reflected upon his aging, which as someone about to hit my 30s myself was definitely a mood. No idea how long this'll stick with me, but it's been a really nice mood brightener anytime I happen to put it on in the last month, and I can easily recommend it if these commercial deep house styles happen to be your thing. Honorable mention number 6, Knick Knack Irate Tea. Out of all the random under-the-radar finds I picked up from Bandcamp Daily this year, this is probably the hardest one to sum up quickly. I guess you could call this primarily an experimental noise record, considering the multiple tracks consisting entirely of formless clusters of electronic sound effects. Not harsh noise, mind you, just noise. Bleeps and bloops and whirs and clicks and the like, without any structure, that are intense and propulsive, but not hard on the ears necessarily. But this album also has multiple just classic style drum and bass tracks, which are way more accessible. Some with vocal guests and some with jazzier flavors, some going to that classic A Guy Called Gerald sort of experimental feel. There's also spacey ambient tracks, and it ends in a soulful R&B ballad. Every track sounds almost completely different from the next, but the whole thing is tied together through its Afrofuturist cyberpunk concept, and the way everything's trying to evoke the Blade Runner type imagery on the album cover, as well as explore the artist's identity as a black woman working in electronic music, all with pretty well polished production to boot. The pacing on the album may not exactly be the best, there are some moments that can drag a bit, and you absolutely need to hear the whole thing front to back, slower paced moments and all, to really get the full vision behind it. No individual track is really capable of selling this thing if you purely take it out of context. But needless to say, there wasn't any listening experience I had this year quite like Irate Tea, and it kept sticking in the back of my mind, so make sure to check it out if that sounds like your cup of tea. Honorable mention number 7, Saishi, Death of Mishima. And while we're on the topic of ambient-leaning records with cyberpunk theming and Blade Runner-type vibes, this was the very last cut I made from the list proper, a cross between, like, mid-2010s vaporwave and 70s synth throwbacks coming out of this Italian producer releasing on Lee Norris's Neo Tantra label that turned out to be one of the most refreshing ambient projects I'd heard all year. Loads of immersive melancholic vibes, warm melodies, and spacey textures, and the melodies are all structured pretty similarly, as if all meant to be variations on the same theme, but the execution is still distinct from track to track, with cuts that either focus on those melodies, make them blurrier, give them more of a backbeat, or what have you, and the reprising of ideas kind of feels like different acts of a stage play or something. Just really freaking nice stuff. Honorable mention number 8, Yarny, Little Island EP. And finally, I may not count EPs towards my lists, but if I did, this would definitely be on it. This was a lovely, organic blend of deep house and downtempo that was super well textured and uplifting with lots of different instrumentation going into it. I loved the thicker disco grooves in moments, the really nice cello performances from Emily Marks, and the one guitar performance from Give Me Monaco. The production was phenomenal and felt so nicely detailed and enveloping, just a fantastic mood brightener anytime I put it on, and I never got sick of it despite being one of my more frequently replayed projects of the year, and being shorter than anything else on the list this year, so yeah, absolutely check this out if you missed it. And that's going to do it for the honorable mentions, but now it's time to get through a bunch more of my favorite individual tracks of the year. All from projects worth hearing and picking up in their own right, but I wouldn't have room in a video like this to shout out. Got 30 tracks to go through, but if that seems like a lot, know that I actually had to cut that list down quite a bit from being even longer. There were just a lot of good projects this year with a lot of tracks I wanted to shout out, so let's get through a bunch of those other highlights. Going alphabetically by artist. And I think that'll be enough of that. Again, I cut quite a bit out of there so as not to stretch this video out too much. Here's the names of 10 more tracks on screen that I didn't feel like I had room for, but were also in pretty close consideration, in case you didn't think I was really serious about the amount of good albums I heard this year. I mean, the quantity of music to pick from was not the problem. But, okay, anyway, let's finally get to the list proper. Number 10. Lance Gurusek, Proffer. So let's start out with an under-the-radar pick that I haven't seen anyone else talking about. I will admit this is low on the list because I didn't really put this album on that often this year, but I feel like I should have put it on more often. Anytime I did, I was like, oh yeah, this is absolutely my shit, and again, there wasn't really anything like it this year to compare it to. This is a stellar-sounding mix of 70s-inspired progressive synth arrangements inspired by pioneers like Manuel Gosking and Terry Riley, along with super lush string sections and deep and satisfying live drumming and bass inspired by the band Air. The latter influence, in particular, made this really stick out in my mind, since projects that can recapture that band's appeal in any meaningful way are very rare. And it grew on me over time, too. At first I felt like the pacing was a little hit and miss, and I mainly just gravitated towards the more energetic cuts like Prednisone, Welter, and Nepzine, which are still my favorites here, and I feel most demonstrate a unique flavor to this album which I couldn't get elsewhere. But I warmed up to the more low-key cuts too, for how nice their string arrangements were, and especially the epic 8-minute centerpiece balance, really nailing the appeal of those old 70s synth pioneers. Again, I'm not really sure why this didn't bring me in for more repeat listens than it did. It kinda floored me every time I was able to make time for it, so yeah, very high recommendation for this. Deserves to get more attention for sure. Number 9. Throwing Snow, Isthmus. Next up, we got a bit of a weird one. I'll freely admit this album was not something I was always in the mood for, and while I was really hyped on it initially, there were some listens later in the year where it oddly just kind of bounced off me, hence why it's only at number 9. But man, when it hit, it really freaking hit. I was always struck by how damn unpredictable it was. On my first listen, just picking it up blind from Bandcamp Daily without knowing how much acclaim he had gotten for other projects in the past, I just could not have foreseen any of the random twists and turns this thing went on. There were super heavy electro-industrial bangers, there were weird abstract cuts that brought in overt Indian influences, there was dubstep, there was some kind of chill house stuff, there was ambient, and seemingly everything in between. No two tracks sounded alike, and no snippet I play here will be able to do the full thing justice. But it still fit together and felt cohesive somehow. The whole thing just had this super epic and propulsive high-stakes feel to it, while also feeling very lo-fi, raw, and stripped down in its production style, and also with a little bit of an organic touch sometimes. Gave me a very similar feeling to how I felt when I first heard Nathan Fake's Blizzards back in 2020, of just someone doing loads of super creative stuff out of somewhat simple synth arrangements, but it's also a lot more eclectic and out of the box than even that album was. I don't know, while I suppose a bit of the initial novelty did eventually wear off over time and it became more of an album best suited for a certain time and place and mood, it still more than convinced me that Throwing Snow was a name that I needed to be paying attention to for a lot longer than just this year, especially given he has at least 2 older albums which are even better. Mosaic in 2014 and Embers from 2017 are pretty awesome too, but picking this up without having heard anything else he did pretty much immediately made me a fan of the guy, and if you haven't experienced this wild ride yet, you'll want to make sure to do that. Number 8. Maria Chiara Argiro, Closer. You know, I mentioned at the time I covered this one that I didn't expect it to make the list unless we got a 2019-style drought of great electronic music this year, which, I mean, yeah, that did in fact happen, and the drought in question did allow this album to get a pretty decent head start in terms of replay value. But even with that in mind, now that we're actually at the end of the year, I do feel like this one really did earn its spot on the list. It really snuck up on me and remained in semi-regular rotation even while actual competition was coming in during the second half of the year. I think this could have been a solid contender for this list even in a better year. I already found the mix of super minimal synth pop beats and sultry and downbeat trip hop singing with even a couple of very mild jazz influences to be quite alluring and intriguing, both delivering a number of solid catchy pop leaning tunes, of which the opener is the very easy highlight, as well as a whole bunch of weird abstract flares and cuts where she's like editing and glitching her voice into incomprehensibility and scattering the fragments over other broken up instrumentals, showcasing a real experimental and artsy edge, which made it all the easier to stick in my mind in a way that a more traditional synth pop record wouldn't have done in the same way. Call it the OMD dazzle ship sort of effect. But yeah, while I could tell there was something low-key special about it fairly early on, it just kind of slotted into that low-stakes comfort food listen spot this year and continued to stay there. Something that could hit well when I was tired out, or hit equally as well whether my brain was on or off. It may not be one of the greatest synth-pop records I've ever heard or anything, and the fact that it's so small-scale and unassuming on the surface may not be the kind of thing that pops out in comparison to other projects this year, but hey, synth-pop isn't a genre that often gets much representation on my year-end lists. I'm more than happy to get a project like this that was able to click with me and keep bringing me back as much as it did without me ever getting sick of it. I could recommend it back when I reviewed it, but that recommendation's even higher now, so go back and give it a spin if you missed it. Number 7. Sungazer, Against the Fall of Night. Now this one just made me happy. I've obviously been a longtime follower of fellow music YouTuber Adam Neely and his electro jazz band with Sean Crowder, Sungazer. They made loads of cool music in the past, mixing their crazy live musical chops with off-the-wall IDM and synthwave and jazz arrangements, with lots of odd time signatures and complex polyrhythms. And they did go pretty damn hard the one time I did see them live. But after their debut album in 2021, Perihelion fell a little short of my high expectations thanks to my being somewhat underwhelmed with its mixing and mastering. It was really nice to get this follow-up, which featured none of the issues I had with that album. Much better produced and more effective at recapturing what it feels like to see them live on record. And where Perihelion sometimes felt like they were throwing in lots of cool musical gimmicks as possible ways to maybe tie their music into something they could promote through their educational YouTube content, which was really cool in its own right. But this album just feels like they wanted to step back from the content side of things and just make music for the love of making and performing music. The grooves are still just as hyper-complex and off-the-wall and high-effort as they always were before, but they feel more, I guess, creatively free, designing tracks more to be felt in the moment rather than to be overthought about like the inner workings of. It's just a super exciting combination of electronic and jazz with tons of energy that makes it really easy to get you hyped up, and I also really appreciated the couple of deeper emotional moments that came in on cuts like Oi Tilde Monk and Cluck of the Long Now, which were some of my easy favorites. Other albums higher up on the list might be even catchier and feel like they have even more substance to them to make it, easier for me to latch on to, but this is just an album you can tell was made out of nothing but pure love for music and makes you really feel that love for music yourself, and that was just great to experience. Number 6. Moby, Always Centered at Night. No, this is not a joke. I really do have a Moby album on the list of the best albums of 2024, after a decade and a half of him delivering material that was merely decent for the most part, and the guy's public reputation getting progressively more and more divisive. And not only that, if you talk to me at the halfway point of the year, this would have been my easy number 1 pick. Yeah, I still can't believe this happened. But I'm over the idea of this album being on the list at all, like, being a statement on the state of the genre. It really isn't. I've always been much more on the side of defending Moby than many seem to be these days, and I'd rather just give him credit for delivering easily his best album since the 2000s, and maybe even one of his best albums to date. Like, easy top 5 for him, at least. I mean, in one breath, this may not stylistically be anything too far afield of what you'd already expect from him, a lot of moody down-tempo and airy dance grooves for the most part, but the conceit of this album is that every track is designed to uplift someone else's voice other than his own. He assembled a cast of 13 different, mostly under-the-radar guest singers and vocalists, all people of color, and only 2 of which I'd actually heard of before hearing this album, being Serpent with Feet and Jose James. And all of whom sound phenomenal and are able to provide a more soulful and optimistic feeling light on the usual darker and depressing introspective themes that all Moby albums have. But on top of that, it feels like Moby's actual instrumentals have like a level of contemporary polish they don't often have to them. Like he's updating his usual sound for the modern era of electronic music without feeling like he's trend chasing. And those instrumentals are surprisingly well varied. Sure, you get downbeat piano ballads and spacey trip hop like usual, but all of those still really hit without feeling boring or tedious. And you'll also get thicker disco and deep house grooves that have a level of infectious energy to them. And not even to get into the multiple full-on drum and bass tracks, like Where Is Your Pride and Medusa. I've never heard Moby try something like that before off the top of my head, and he freaking nails it. And there's somehow not a single miss in the track listing. Every single track provides either some really strong catchy hook or some really strong deeper emotional moment or both. And there's not a single moment that drags or feels like filler, which even some of his biggest classics have. It might be the single most consistent Moby album ever, full stop. I may not be sure if this is the kind of album necessarily likely to convert any Moby naysayers. Chances are if you just never liked any of his stuff to begin with, this probably won't change your mind either. But if you have enjoyed any Moby stuff in the past, even if it's just like the obvious stuff like Play or Everything Is Wrong or 18, give this a shot. It might surprise you. It sure as hell surprised me, and I will definitely take it. Number 5. Hudson Lee, Light Dancer. Next up, here's a name that will probably be less of a surprise, assuming you know who the artist is and that he released another album this year. Hudson Lee, co-founder of the Upscale label and artist collective, has obviously been impressing me with his more low-key and indie-inspired spin on the modern neuro-IDM genre for quite a while now. His debut, Headspaces, was my number 2 favorite album of 2019, and Reflex Angle was pretty solid too. But now he's got another somewhat smaller scale and intimate and organic neuro-IDM romp, which feels like it's maybe even more vulnerable and introspective than his already very personal previous work. And easily his most cohesive and seamless work to date. Each track feels like it's directly designed as a continuation of the next, and like everything is meant to be digested as a single unbroken package. He's taken more influences from the Chinese half of his heritage and gotten more creatively recharged after having moved out to the Pacific Northwest. He's also started writing tracks with his own vocals as the focal point, such as Weather Vanes, and his voice fits perfectly naturally into these mixes. And of course he's brought in a whole bunch of his colleagues on the scene as collaborators, including Coan Sound, Voljum, Frequent, Alexander Panos, and Sebastian Vidra. The album's quite catchy despite how abstract it is. It's got a lot of heavy emotional hitters. It was just a pleasure to put on every single time, and I never got sick of it from the first time I put it on. So if these upscale adjacent styles are your thing, then this is obviously going to be essential listening. Guy's done it again, and I'm happy to see him keep at his unique style and keep me this consistently invested in the process. And on a very similar note, number 4. Vale Smith, If You See a Blur. I'll be honest, whether this or the Hudson Lee album hits more for me is like a flip of the coin, depending on the day. They're functionally tied and more or less fill the exact same niche in my typical listening habits, but I think I gravitated towards ranking Vale Smith higher again, since A, he is still more under the radar, and B, while this album isn't quite as emotionally vulnerable as Light Dancer, or as catchy if I'm being honest, it is more sonically varied and feels more daring and out of the box for him. And I do tend to gravitate more towards albums that have more variety over ones that try to focus on one specific sound. I mean, regardless of which way I'm leaning on any given day, this is now the 3rd year in a row that Vale Smith is making the top 5 of my year-end list. Guy is continuing to absolutely kill it. He's like twisting his typical Wonky future-based garage style into all sorts of new shapes that feel different from anything else I've heard from him before. That whole run of Synapse, Flutter, Mask Man, and Torn Dreams is legit like the craziest sound design I've heard all year. But he's also got light and fluffy instrumental hip-hop like Stars Up High. He's got spacey piano-driven house cuts like Sayonage and Full Health Fallback and Catchphrase, which, man, the latter has really just kept me coming back over and over. He's also got something like Sundial Ultra, which I don't even know how to describe in a quick segment like this. I guess hyperspeed 80s beats and acoustic guitars or something, I don't know. Guys just continued to keep up this hot streak he's had going and finding new ways to impress me. Of course, I kinda half expected this to be a contender for the list immediately when he announced it. If you've been following this channel for long enough, Veilsmith being here won't be a surprise. If you want the pick on this list that caught me the most off guard, that I think it might have to be either Moby or this next one. Number 3. LPGOB, Daughter. Is this love? You know, it's kind of weird to think that I just dropped this into a random Some Stuff I Missed roundup without any real expectations for it like a month ago. I generally liked LPGOB's debut album Light Places last year. It had a few good tracks on it that brought me back more than I thought they would, despite the album as a whole being super commercial and ready-made to soundtrack advertisements. And there was just barely enough quality there to make me curious on what a follow-up would look like. I wasn't expecting said follow-up to not only floor me and stand out as properly great to me on first listen, but also keep growing on me after I reviewed it, and now it's all the way up this high on the list. I don't know if I can fully put it into words, but this album is almost starting to feel to me like a culmination of the super house-centric direction mainstream dance music has been going on over the past several years, and specifically the most mainstream of it, following in the footsteps of when Odessa made The Last Goodbye in 2022 and impressed me more than I expected, or Fred again breaking out and becoming a big deal and not impressing me that much. LPGOB might have previously just blended into that kind of crowd and fallen into Odessa's shadow in particular with how she utilized soul samples in pretty much the exact same way as them. But now with this album, I'm feeling like Odessa and Fred again walked so that LPGOB could run. She's now rising above her obvious comparison points in my mind and making some of the best mainstream dance music I've heard in ages. At least since the best parts of, like, Ryksopp's Profound Mysteries trilogy, although this required absolutely no editing. And yeah, this album can still sound like the soundtrack to commercials. I mean, Portugal the Man is even on it to do a disco track with her in the vein of Feel It Still. But there's still a level of sincerity and emotional realness that I consistently felt out of this stuff that I think is informed a lot by how this album is paying direct tribute to people in LPGOB's life that helped put her on the path to success she's seen now but are no longer with her. And that sense of unspoken grief and raw emotional vulnerability is really translated well through all the piano and even string arrangements that show up on several tracks, and was something I could tangibly feel, not just in the obvious moments that let you really sink into them, like the acoustic folk gut punch that is 2 Days Older, or the lengthier string-backed house mini-epic Succession, but even in all the album's most commercial moments too. Tracks could have, like, total empty platitudes in the lyrics on paper, like there's a track about how it's so nice to be in love, but it's being sold in such a way that really makes me feel like there's something deeper to it and think, yeah, it is so nice to be in love. That was actually my favorite track on the album on first listen. Every singer, sampled or guest feature, sounds like they really believe in what they're singing. And sure, for the record, Odessa could have that effect on me too. Light of Day is probably still a better individual track than anything on this album, but this album is way more consistent than The Last Goodbye. There is not a single skip or even a redundant track here. Every track has a well-defined identity to make sure nothing runs together, but all of it feels super cohesive and well-flowing, with tracks even segueing really well into each other. Now, I guess it's possible other people aren't going to see where I'm coming from on this. Despite all the promo she's gotten, I don't think I've actually seen anyone else talking about this album. I would totally get it if it just didn't stand out to other people for feeling too much like everything else on the radio, but this really got to me on that deeper level. I think it's really going to be sticking with me longer term and stay in my mind as one of the better examples of the specific mainstream trends in dance music we've gotten this decade. It's frankly way more on par with my much more predictable top 2 picks than you'd think, and it's even possible this could have had a shot for the top spot itself if it got more than like a month to sit with me. But yeah, of course there were 2 more, even better projects this year that also felt like a culmination of the house trends we've gotten over the 2020s. Hell, this wasn't even the most mainstream one or the one from the artist with the biggest industry backing on the list. That honor obviously goes to... Number 2, Jamie XX in Waves. Hey, there's a lot less separating this and the LPGOB project than it might seem on the surface. They're about equally deep or thought-provoking, right down to several tracks here, including the best ones, feeling like they could easily be dropped in the middle of Coke ads or something. I think Daughter might have even hit on a stronger emotional level with me than this did, but I think Jamie XX still gets the edge, since he's clearly been allowed to have more creative freedom to do whatever the hell he wants, and get a bit weirder, as well as try to more authentically capture the sounds of underground club bangers from 30 years ago, where LPGOB still feels like she's playing a bit of the radio pop game. I mean, let's be real, I'm probably not the only one who saw this album being announced at all and immediately expected it to be like my favorite of the year. It's been nearly a decade since In Color, and in that time, that album slowly grew from being a great year-end list contender when it first came out to a proper all-time favorite and low-key game changer and era definer in retrospect. I don't expect In Waves to make the same kind of waves. It fits a little too well into the already existing trends to feel like it's likely to move the needle for the genre in the same way, but it's still abundantly clear from this album how much passion Jamie XX has for classic club music, and man does he still have all the talent to make that stuff really hit. And in terms of what the catchiest album was this year, it's not even close. Nearly every track on this thing is an insidious earworm and has gotten trapped in my head for extended periods of time. So many infectious bops on here. Treat Each Other Right, Baddie on the Floor, Life. Daffodil really snuck up on me too, despite the non-structure of that one. He got the XX back together for a track on Waited All Night. He sampled the Moody Blues on a track and made it sound kinda like Spunk Shine. He made a weird experimental drum and bass cut as a breather. He even brought on the freaking Avalanches on a track, and somehow that wasn't one of the bigger highlights. This comeback felt every bit as much like a big event as we were all hoping it to be. Well, I have also seen plenty of people calling this a letdown, and to be honest, I kinda get why. I think the vast majority of us can agree that this is not as good as In Color. Just doesn't go as deep or sound as unique, but that is still a very high bar, and it's clear that this was trying to be something completely different, not easily comparable to his previous work. I think there is more than enough quality here, as well as a very different kind of appeal to feel like a worthy new evolution in his sound. But as hard as this album hit, and as close as it was to taking the top spot, there was one last big event in the house music world that went a little deeper and hit a little harder, albeit in a very different way. And you can probably already guess what that is by process of elimination if you've been paying attention to the channel lately, so let's just get into that. Number 1. Floating Points, Cascade. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be going against the grain on this one. This album taking the top spot is admittedly very tenuous. It was a very close race for most of the last third of the year, but I think I eventually just settled on this one because the Jamie XX album was technically a step down from his previous work, and this album was another one that I put on merely expecting it to be pretty good, and turned out to possibly be my favorite Floating Points album yet. I don't feel like I really recognized this guy's game before now. Which is weird to say, given how creative all his various jazz crossovers in the past have been, and how much of a universally agreed upon emotional knockout that Promises with Pharoah Sanders was. This album, meanwhile, is just a regular old tech house record, so straightforward and to the point that if I didn't already know Floating Points made it, I wouldn't be able to guess that easily. And yet, here it is, topping the list in a year where I was starting to get kinda burned out on house. It's just that masterfully well-paced and well-structured. Literally some of the most consistently exciting, plain old vanilla tech house I've ever heard in my life. Each track builds up and down in just the perfect way to maximize that sense of tension and release. Each track changes and evolves over time and keeps introducing new ideas, most obviously seen on a moment like Okotio, which gradually drifts from delicate ambience to hyperspeed synth stabs to banging beats over the course of almost 9 minutes. And the tracks that don't evolve as much have some other really striking idea that was already capable of maintaining your attention, like how thick that I Feel Love bassline on Birth 4000 was, or how damn epic those lead arpeggios get on Fast Forward, or the more chill-leaning finish on Tilt Shift and Ablaze, which feel like a satisfying exhale at the end of a long journey. This album's already got tons of acclaim, and much as was the case when Ski Mask topped my list in 2021, I'm not gonna disagree with any of the hype it's already gotten. Sometimes the people get it right. But just as with the 2 albums ranked directly below it, and probably more than those given the comparative lack of mainstream radio pop accessibility, which will obviously allow the more underground-minded among us embrace it all the more easily, I feel like this one's really going to go down as a consistent staple in the whole broader genre of house. Not for changing anyone's perceptions about what this genre is capable of, but just providing something easy for people to point to and say, now this is how you freaking make house music, and even get people who aren't that down with house music to understand. It's the album this year that I found the easiest to come back to and replay, already the biggest breath of fresh air when I first heard it after like 8 months of feeling kinda underwhelmed by the state of electronic music and not finding enough that I wanted to keep replaying like I did with this. It feels like another notable culmination of this moment in time for dance music, and one that's likely going to be sticking around for quite a long time, and yeah, it's my favorite album of 2024. So there we have it. That's my list. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year.